Nashville, 1964. A girl from the Smoky Mountains, one of 12 children raised in a one-room cabin without electricity, steps off a Greyhound and into a city that does not know her name. She carries a cardboard suitcase, a handful of demo tapes, and the kind of blind ambition that either builds an empire or breaks a person in half. Dolly Rebecca Parton is 18 years old, and the great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee are still clinging to her vowels, her hair, and her expectations about what a life can become. Nashville in 1964 operated like a factory with a velvet curtain draped over the entrance. Talent was cheap. The city ran on a system of record labels, publishing houses, radio programmers, and talent managers who decided often before a singer recorded a single note who would get a shot and who would bust tables until they gave up and drove home. Dolly had arrived with a contract from a small label called Monument Records, which made her luckier than 90% of the hopefuls pouring into town that year. Monument's interest, though, was cautious and conditional, entirely dependent on whether this teenage girl from Locust Ridge could be shaped into something the market would buy. On her first day in town, she wandered to a laundromat called the Wishy-Washy because even future legends need clean clothes, and a 21-year-old man named Carl Thomas Dean, leaning against a truck in the Tennessee heat, spotted her crossing the street. He liked what he saw. The rest of that first afternoon depends on who you ask. Carl Dean never told his version, not once, not to a single journalist, not in 60 years, so we only have Dolly's account. He hollered something from across the road. She walked over, they fell into conversation, and he drove her around Nashville that afternoon, showing her a city she barely knew while she sat in the passenger seat of a stranger's truck, wondering whether this was brave or stupid. Carl began visiting her every evening on her aunt's front porch within days, sitting with her as the summer cooled, and he kept coming back night after night until a full week of porch visits had passed and he finally brought her home to meet his parents. That gesture meant something. In rural Tennessee in the 1960s, it carried about as much weight as a formal proposal, a declaration that this was not casual and that the families were now involved. No photographer, no gossip column, no record label publicist ever documented any of it. Two young people from working-class Tennessee families met outside a laundromat, and one of them would become the most famous woman in country music, while the other would spend the rest of his life making sure almost nobody on earth knew what he looked like. That asymmetry, one person becoming the most visible entertainer in America while the other became perhaps the most invisible spouse in modern celebrity history, would fuel 60 years of tabloid speculation, conspiracy theories, whispered accusations, and genuine mystery. Millions of people would eventually ask the same question: was Carl Dean even real? He was, and the marriage they built together was stranger, darker, more painful, and more deliberately constructed than any interview, any memoir, or any tabloid headline ever fully captured. Their courtship ran into obstacles almost immediately. Carl received his Army draft notice, which delayed any wedding plans and pulled him away during the months when most young couples in Tennessee were settling into routines of church, family dinners, and Friday night drives. When he returned from the service, a different kind of resistance emerged, not from Carl, not from Dolly's family, but from the machinery of Nashville itself. Monument Records feared that a married Dolly Parton would alienate male fans and cripple the commercial trajectory they were carefully engineering. The math was cold. A young, single, beautiful woman with a big voice and bigger hair sold records, filled seats, and generated the kind of male fantasy that drove radio play. A married woman with a husband back home did none of those things. The label wanted Dolly available, not literally, but symbolically, and a wedding ring complicated that image in ways the label's accountants and promoters did not want to manage. So Dolly and Carl waited. For 2 years, they maintained a courtship that Nashville's music industry either ignored or actively discouraged, and by 1966, Parton had grown tired of bending her personal life to fit her label's marketing strategy. On May 30th of that year, the couple drove south across the Tennessee border to Ringgold, Georgia, a small town that had built an unofficial reputation as the place Nashville couples went when they wanted to marry quickly, quietly, and without the city's press corps catching wind. 5 people attended. The ceremony included Dolly, Carl, Dolly's mother, the preacher, and the preacher's wife, with no photographer, no reception, and no announcement in the Tennessean. Monument Records learned about the marriage after the fact, when reversing it was no longer an option, and the only available response was to pretend it had not happened. Marrying in secret in a border town with a guest list smaller than most dinner parties established the template for everything that followed, and the marriage would exist on Carl Dean's terms going forward, private, invisible, and almost entirely outside the machinery of Dolly Parton's public career. How seriously did Carl enforce this boundary? Shortly after the wedding, Dolly brought Carl to a music industry awards ceremony in Nashville, the kind of glad-handing, camera-flashing event that defined her professional world and that any spouse in the country music scene was expected to attend, smile through, and endure. According to Dolly's account, Carl attended that single ceremony, turned to her afterward, and told her something she would repeat in interviews for the rest of her life. He loved her, he supported her career completely, but he would never attend another public event again. He kept that promise for 59 years. Carl Dean never walked another red carpet, never appeared at another award show, never sat in the audience at a concert, and never once stood beside his wife for an official press photograph. Grammy nights, movie premieres, the 1986 opening of Dollywood, a theme park bearing her name where, by Carl's own insistence, no photograph of him hung on any wall. He was absent from all of it. When asked about this, he reportedly joked that the only way he would appear in a photo at Dollywood was with a bag over his head. Most celebrity couples define privacy as controlling the narrative. Carl Dean defined privacy as erasing himself from the narrative entirely, and he did it so thoroughly that his absence became, paradoxically, the most famous thing about him. Carl Dean's day job had nothing to do with fame. He owned and operated an asphalt paving business in Nashville, a blue-collar enterprise about as far from sequined stage costumes as a career can get. While Dolly toured the world in custom-built buses, performing to stadiums of tens of thousands, Carl paved driveways and parking lots in Middle Tennessee, visited auto parts stores, and attended local baseball games, living the life of a man whose wife was not, by any observable evidence, one of the most recognized humans alive. His disappearance from public life was so complete that it spawned one of the more peculiar celebrity conspiracy theories of the 20th century. Carl Dean did not exist. The rumor was specific. Parton had invented a husband, according to the theory, a fictional character, a paper spouse, fashioned as a shield against the romantic advances of industry men and the sexual expectations that 1970s Nashville placed on its female performers. A phantom husband explained the ring on her finger without requiring anyone to actually produce the man who had placed it there. The rumor amused her. Parton addressed it directly in a 1984 interview with the Associated Press, laughing about it, noting that people genuinely believed she had fabricated a husband to keep other people off me. She recognized the absurdity of defending the existence of a person she went home to every night, and treated the whole conspiracy with the kind of bemused patience that only someone married to a real, breathing, asphalt paving man could muster. Carl had not vanished because he was fictional, though. He had simply perfected the art of vanishing while remaining very much alive, and the most striking proof of this skill involved his own front lawn. When reporters staked out the couple's home in Brentwood, Tennessee, an upscale suburb south of Nashville where the Deans owned a large rural property, Carl would occasionally stroll outside and tell the gathered journalists that he was the estate's gardener, just the man who trimmed the hedges. And because nobody on earth knew what Carl Dean looked like, because not a single press photograph of his face circulated in any newsroom in the country, the reporters believed him, packed up their cameras, and drove away, never suspecting that the man who had just lied to their faces was the husband they had been staking out the property to photograph. That required extraordinary discipline. One of the most photographed women in the world lived with a man so thoroughly unphotographed that he could stand on his own front lawn, speak to reporters face to face, invent a fake job title on the spot, and walk back inside unrecognized. Dolly herself explained his motivations in practical terms, telling interviewers across multiple decades that Carl remained private because anonymity gave him freedom to run errands, attend ball games, and move through the world without anyone connecting him to her fame. It was not pathology. His invisibility in her telling was a rational calculation. If nobody recognized Carl Dean, then Carl Dean could live a normal life, even if his wife never could. Sandy Gallen, Parton's manager for 25 years and her business partner in the production company they co-owned, offered a different angle, one focused less on Carl's preference and more on its practical consequences for Dolly's output. The assessment was blunt. Gallen observed that Parton's extraordinary professional productivity, the relentless touring, the songwriting, the film career, the business empire, was made possible specifically because Dean provided a quiet, stable anchor back home, never competing for her spotlight, never demanding she slow down, and never appearing at industry events expecting introductions or a chair at the table. Whether this arrangement was liberating, lonely, or some unstable compound of both depended entirely on which year of their marriage you examined. The rumors never stopped. Carl's absence left a void that speculation filled the way water fills a crack in a dam, quickly and forcefully, and without much concern for what was actually on the other side. The most persistent theory, after the Carl doesn't exist line had been retired, targeted Dolly's relationship with Judy Ogle. Their bond went back decades. Both women had been inseparable since childhood in the Smoky Mountains, growing up in the same impoverished stretch of East Tennessee where indoor plumbing was a luxury and neighbors functioned more like extended family, and their closeness only deepened as Dolly's career grew. Ogle became Parton's full-time assistant, road companion, and constant presence. The person who occupied the seat next to Dolly on tour buses, shared hotel rooms during months-long concert swings, and answered the phone when Dolly called in the middle of the night. In her 1994 autobiography, Dolly, My Life and Other Unfinished Business, Parton documented this relationship in detail. Ogle was everything. She described her as a valet and sounding board and a woman who lived with her on the road and functioned as the single most constant presence in her daily life outside of Carl. And given how rarely Dolly and Carl occupied the same city during touring seasons, Ogle's company may have been even more constant than Carl's. The bond was intimate but platonic, Parton insisted, the kind of friendship that develops between two people who have known each other since before either of them had anything worth protecting. Tabloids drew a different conclusion entirely. For decades, gossip columns speculated that the marriage to Carl was a front, a convenient legal fiction that allowed Parton and Ogle to live as romantic partners without destroying Dolly's career in the conservative country music market, where the audience skewed rural, religious, and deeply uncomfortable with anything that challenged traditional gender roles. Parton denied this with increasing frustration over the years, pushing back directly in a 1991 interview with Vanity Fair, and stating plainly in a 2019 interview with The Sun that while she supported the gay community, she was straight, and the persistent rumors embarrassed Ogle more than they bothered her. The denials never fully killed the theory. No denial can compete with a story that people want to believe, and the image of Dolly Parton maintaining a decades-long secret love affair possessed a romantic appeal that no amount of on-the-record correction could dissolve. Then there were the men. Tabloids linked Dolly to nearly every male co-star she worked with, but no name recurred more frequently than Burt Reynolds, her co-star in The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas. Parton acknowledged that their on-screen chemistry fed the gossip machine, and she handled the Reynolds rumors with the kind of sly deflection that made her one of the most skilled interview subjects in entertainment, once noting with a grin that she had gotten Carl's permission in writing to kiss Reynolds on screen. Whether this was a joke or an actual notarized document, she never clarified. The ambiguity was the point. But of all the romantic ghosts that haunted the Parton-Dean marriage, the most culturally durable was not a real person but a song. Jolene, released in 1973, became one of the most recognizable tracks in the history of country music, a desperate, pleading ballad addressed to a beautiful woman who threatened to steal the narrator's man. Everyone wanted to know who she was, fans obsessed for decades over the identity of the real Jolene, debating whether she had actually taken Carl and whether she was still out there somewhere living with the knowledge that she had inspired a classic. Parton answered the question in a 2008 interview with NPR. The answer was both more mundane and more revealing than the mythology suggested. A tall, red-headed bank teller who had flirted with Carl shortly after the couple married, noticed by both Dolly and Carl, and eventually turned into a running joke between them, a piece of marital humor that Parton transmuted into a #1 single, a cultural phenomenon, and one of the most covered songs in music history. The real flirtation lasted a few visits to a bank window, but the song it inspired has outlived both of them. By the early 1980s, the machine Dolly and Carl had built, fame for her, silence for him, distance between them measured in tour buses and time zones, began showing fractures that no interview quip could conceal. In 1984, Parton underwent a partial hysterectomy to treat severe endometriosis, a condition that had caused her years of pain and medical complications, and the surgery permanently ended whatever chance the couple had of conceiving a biological child. The loss cut deep. Speaking to The Guardian in 2014, Dolly reflected on it with a candor that had taken decades to develop, recalling that she and Carl had once picked out names for their future children, Carla for a girl among them, and that the anticipation of parenthood had been part of the architecture of their early marriage, one of the assumed milestones that couples in the 1960s in Tennessee expected to reach as naturally as buying a house or planting a garden. Dolly told The Guardian that she had come to accept, even appreciate, the absence of motherhood. Her reasoning was brutally honest about her own psychology. She believed that if she had become a mother, the guilt of touring while her children grew up without her would have destroyed her career, that she would have quit entirely because half measures were not in her nature, and the image of her children asking why mommy was always gone would have eaten her alive. Motherhood and her career, in her own estimation, could not coexist. The hysterectomy, in a grim way, resolved a dilemma she might never have had the strength to resolve on her own. That acceptance came later. It was shaped by years of distance from the grief and years of professional triumphs that filled the space where parenthood might have lived. But in the early 1980s, the pain was raw and immediate, and it collided with something else Dolly had been carrying, a secret she would not fully discuss for years. In Dolly on Dolly, a 2017 anthology of Parton's historical magazine and newspaper interviews, edited by Randy L. Schmidt, the details of this period emerged in fragments. They were pieced together from her own words across multiple publications spanning decades. During the years surrounding her hysterectomy, while battling depression, physical recovery, and the grinding demands of a career that never paused for personal catastrophe, Parton had an intense affair of the heart. She never named the man or confirmed whether the relationship became physical, describing it only as an emotional entanglement that consumed her, a connection so overwhelming that the guilt of maintaining it while married to Carl shredded whatever stability she had left. The guilt compounded until one night, alone in her bedroom, Dolly Parton picked up a gun with the intention of ending her own life. What stopped her was almost absurdly ordinary. Her dog, a small pet named Popeye, ran up the stairs and into the bedroom, and the sound of the animal's paws tapping on the hardwood broke through whatever fog had descended. Parton interpreted the moment as a divine intervention, God sending a message through a pet's clumsy, oblivious entrance, and she put the gun down. No intervention team arrived, no phone call landed at the right second, just a dog scrambling up a staircase while a woman decided to stay alive. How Carl Dean reacted to the emotional affair, the depression, or the night with the gun remains unknown. He said nothing. Not a word about any of it ever left his mouth, not to the press, not in any recorded format, not in a single sentence that entered the public record. Every account of this period comes filtered entirely through Dolly's own narration, delivered years or decades after the fact. In interviews where she controlled the framing, the language, and the emotional temperature of each disclosure, Carl's silence, which in other decades had registered as a charming eccentricity or a practical convenience, became during this chapter something more disquieting, an absence so complete that the interior of their marriage during its worst crisis remains invisible to history. Dolly Parton gave thousands of interviews across her career. She possessed a rare gift for saying things that sounded shockingly candid, while revealing almost nothing she hadn't pre-approved for public consumption, and her comments about her marriage were a masterclass in this technique, a decades-long performance of apparent openness that, examined closely, concealed as much as it revealed. In 1978, Playboy magazine asked her directly whether her constant touring gave her opportunities to cheat on Carl. The reply became legendary. "How do you know I don't?" she answered, before following the quip with a more measured statement that if she or Carl ever had outside hookups, she wouldn't want to know and he wouldn't want to tell her, but that no matter what happened, she would always go back to her husband. The quote detonated across tabloid culture, with gossip columnists interpreting it as a confession, while fans debated whether Dolly Parton had just admitted in a national magazine that she and Carl maintained an open marriage, a concept that in 1978 America still carried enough scandal to damage a country star's career if the wrong radio programmers got offended. Years later, speaking to the Mirror, Parton reframed the statement with the precision of someone who had spent decades learning how sentences ricocheted through media. She drew a hard line, and the marriage was open only in the sense of innocent flirting, she clarified, not sex and not affairs. And she added a line that carried a very different energy from the breezy Playboy quip, "I would kill him if I thought he was doing that. He would shoot me too." She closed by insisting they loved each other madly, with no qualifications and no winking ambiguity. Between those two interviews lay 20-odd years, an emotional affair that nearly killed her, a hysterectomy that foreclosed parenthood, and the accumulated weight of a marriage conducted largely in separate zip codes. The young Dolly could afford to be cavalier about fidelity. The older Dolly had learned painfully what infidelity actually felt like from the inside, and the shift in tone from playful provocation to territorial bluntness tracked that distance precisely. Speaking to Parade in 2015, she described the marriage in warmer terms, though they were still tinged with a kind of bemused distance. "We're completely opposite, but that's what makes it fun. I never know what he's going to say or do." Even warmth carried an admission. After 50 years of marriage, Dolly Parton still found her own husband somewhat unpredictable, somewhat opaque, and somewhat beyond her ability to fully explain to an audience. Carl, for his part, broke his public silence exactly once. In 2016, to mark their 50th wedding anniversary, an occasion they celebrated by renewing their vows, he released a brief written statement through a publicist. "My first thought was, I'm going to marry that girl. My second thought was, Lord, she's good looking. And that was the day my life began." 2 sentences covering 50 years, that was everything the public would ever hear from Carl Dean in his own voice. In 2019, a photograph appeared in the tabloids that for anyone else would have been entirely unremarkable. An older man in khaki pants and a baseball cap, running errands in Brentwood, Tennessee, walking across a parking lot with the unhurried gait of someone thinking about lunch, not legacy. The man was Carl Dean. According to Extra TV, it was the first time he had been photographed by the press in approximately 40 years. 4 decades between camera clicks. The photograph circulated not because it showed anything unusual, but because it proved once again that Carl Dean was a real person who occupied physical space and bought groceries like everyone else. What the photograph did not reveal, what no press outlet confirmed until after his death, was that Carl had been living with Alzheimer's disease since roughly that same year. The man in the parking lot had already begun losing the memories of a marriage that had consumed his entire adult life. The porch visits, the secret ceremony in Ringgold, the gardener disguise, the paving company, The 50 years of chosen silence and whatever he truly thought about Dolly's career, her fame, or the night she reached for a gun. All of it dissolving in a process that no amount of privacy could control. Carl Thomas Dean died in Nashville on March 3, 2025, at the age of 82. His family never released an official cause of death, though multiple outlets, including Men's Journal and Dublin Live, corroborated that Alzheimer's had affected him for years prior to his passing. Dolly released a statement on Instagram. "Carl and I spent many wonderful years together. Words can't do justice to the love we shared for over 60 years. 17 months later, Dolly Parton died in Nashville at the age of 80 after a brief battle with cancer. The date was August 25, 2026. Her nephew, Brian Seaver, announced her passing to the world, a final act of family gatekeeping in a tradition that Carl himself had established decades earlier. According to Dublin Live, she had put her own health concerns aside in Carl's final years to care for him through the progression of his disease, a detail that reframed their long separations in a new and uncomfortable light. The woman who had spent decades on the road away from her husband, building an empire he refused to enter, spent his last years at his side, watching the man she married outside a laundromat forget everything. Here is what we know for certain about the marriage of Dolly Parton and Carl Dean. The facts are sparse. They met outside a laundromat in 1964, married in secret in 1966, and remained legally wed until his death in 2025, a span of 58 years and 9 months. Carl attended one public event and never attended another, while Dolly became one of the most recognized humans on the planet and Carl paved driveways. She wrote Jolene about a bank teller who smiled at him too long, and he wrote her love poems that no journalist has ever read. Here is what we do not know. Carl Dean's actual thoughts about any of it, his feelings about Dolly's fame, about her touring schedule, about the emotional affair that nearly destroyed her, about the decades they spent in different cities, about the conspiracy theory that he did not exist. None of it survives in any recorded statement, interview, memoir, or document beyond a single 2-sentence anniversary message released through a publicist in 2016. Every description of Carl's personality, his motivations, and his inner life that exists in the public record was written, spoken, or approved by Dolly Parton. She controlled the story. She was not merely the narrator of her own life, but the sole narrator of his, and Carl's silence, maintained with the discipline of a man who could stand on his own front lawn and convince reporters armed with cameras that he trimmed hedges for a living, ensured that the version of their marriage the world received was always exclusively hers. Closer Weekly reported that the couple built a private chapel on their Tennessee farm and that Carl regularly wrote Dolly love poems, but no independent sources ever confirmed either claim, with no property records for the chapel, no family member willing to go on the record, and no second witness to the poems. Nobody can verify any of it. The chapel may exist and the poems may be beautiful, or the whole story may belong to the same half-lit space where most of this marriage lived. Somewhere between the facts Dolly chose to share and the silence Carl chose to keep. She told the whole world everything, while he told the whole world nothing, and they were married for 58 years, buried in the same city where they met, 6 decades and 17 months apart, in a story that neither one of them, for entirely different reasons, ever fully told.